Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Sealing the Right Records, Cutting Red Tape and Focusing on Real Threats. I'm Sarah Anderson, Associate Director of Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties at the R Street Institute, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. At R Street, we believe in pragmatic, evidence-based solutions that support public safety while upholding individual liberty. Clean slate policies, which automatically seal eligible nonviolent criminal records after a period of rehabilitation, represent one such innovation. These laws aren't about erasing the past. They're about removing outdated barriers that hinder policing, clog our courts, and complicate reentry long after someone has served their sentence. Today's panel features three of R Street's criminal justice policy scholars who will help us unpack exactly how Clean Slate impacts the full life cycle of the criminal justice system, from the front lines of policing to the prosecutorial trenches to the critical work of reentry and reintegration. We have three esteemed colleagues from the R Street Institute joining us today to talk about the three different facets of the system I just mentioned. Firstly, we have Liesl Pettis, who is the policy director of our criminal justice and civil liberties team. Liesl is a former prosecutor as well as a former city councilor and heads up our pretrial policy work at R Street. She'll speak to how clean slate policies can help streamline court operations and reduce unnecessary backlogs without compromising public safety. Logan Seacrest is R Street's resident fellow for criminal justice and civil liberties. Before joining R Street, Logan spent over a decade in both the legislative and judicial branches of government, where he worked on the same issues he does today: policing policy, juvenile justice, and civil liberties. Logan will walk us through the reentry and reintegration side of the equation, explaining how automatic criminal record sealing benefits probation officers, reduces recidivism, and helps individuals reinvest in their communities. Finally, we have Jillian Snyder, who is R Street's resident senior fellow for criminal justice and civil liberties. A retired New York Police Department officer, professor, and public safety scholar, Jillian will discuss how clean slate policies can improve officer efficiency, reduce burnout, and support stronger relationships between police and the communities they serve. Our main goal today is to demystify clean slate by focusing on its practical impact in communities once implemented. What does it mean for officers responding to calls? How about for prosecutors managing heavy caseloads? And finally, for probation officers trying to guide successful reentry. We'll have time at the end for audience questions, so feel free to drop those into the Q&A chat as we go. With that, let's dive in. I really want to start at square one, so I'll turn to you first, Logan. When people talk about second chances, April just happened, which was Second Chance Month, they often forget the bureaucratic burden that individuals face post-conviction in terms of having a successful life after involvement with the criminal justice system. Can you walk us through exactly what clean slate policy is, why it's needed, and how automating record sealing shifts the reentry landscape for those trying to move forward with their lives?
Sure, Sarah. Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's worth actually just discussing a little bit how states currently handle record expungement. Most states currently use a petition-based system to expunge old criminal records. This system is antiquated, complex, expensive, slow. Clean slate basically shifts the burden of clearing these records from the individual to the government. So instead of having to do it yourself, it is done automatically after a certain period of time. Basically, the basic gist, is if folks stay out of trouble for a certain period, the records are automatically sealed. I think this clean slate really begins with a simple acknowledgement. Everyone makes mistakes. 1/3 of American adults have a criminal record. Some of our most celebrated celebrities are convicted felons. You've got Robert Downey Jr., overcame drug addiction, became Iron Man. Martha Stewart served her time. Now she's on TV with Snoop Dogg. I think probably the best example, the current U.S. president, his mugshot literally hangs in the Oval Office right now. I think this speaks to the bipartisan potential for a clean slate. Americans of both parties, of all stripes, love second acts. We love a redemption arc. We love rooting for someone to redeem themselves. And I think most reasonable people would agree that a single error shouldn't permanently define one's future. Yet the current system we have in most states, even a minor conviction, something like a DUI or a nonviolent drug offense, can have lifelong ramifications that continue way, way long past after the sentence has been served. This comes from employers doing background checks. I think 90% of employers do these background checks. 80% of landlords use them to screen applicants. And there's many state hiring laws that restrict people with convictions from hundreds of occupations. Clean Slate basically allows those folks to access employment, safe housing, the building blocks of life. In short, it allows people to get their lives back.
Thanks for mentioning that. And I think something you brought up that's important is exactly what types of records are getting sealed. You mentioned convictions for certain things, but also what goes undiscussed sometimes is arrests that never resulted in a charge or a conviction often stay on people's record as well. But something else that you mentioned that I think it's important to pull out as well is there are currently petition-based systems in a lot of states. So some people who are skeptical of clean slate policy might ask, well, if we already have some type of process for record sealing and expungement to allow people to access a sealed record if they are eligible, why isn't that sufficient? Are people not using it, or what is the landscape around that?
Well, the people use it. I'm familiar with the situation in Missouri. There was just a Missouri clean slate bill that I did a little bit of work on, So Missouri has a petition based system, but it's expensive. There's a lot of paperwork involved. In fact, the process is so arduous. Only 1% of folks in Missouri who qualify for expungement ever actually manage to seal their record. Despite some upfront costs of setting up clean slate, it benefits people because it just handles this process automatically. It's a 21st century solution. It's a digital solution that replaced kind of a wasteful, antiquated bureaucracy that people just aren't equipped really to navigate, particularly if they're struggling to bounce back from a mistake they made and they're struggling with the ramifications of a conviction. It just streamlines the process for those folks.
Yeah, I've heard it mentioned in some states almost as a Doge style process to the government to help take something that the government's doing and make sure that it's efficient. Because I think you said the number is about 1% of people in Missouri. It lingers somewhere around there. Nationwide, maybe a little higher, some places maybe a little lower elsewhere. I think we could all agree that a 1% utilization rate is not what we might call efficient. So much appreciated on that. And Logan, you mentioned Missouri as well. I dropped in the chat a recent piece that you authored on the Missouri clean slate legislation and why folks in Missouri could benefit from clean slate as well. Turning to you, Julian, you've argued that clean slate policies aren't just about redemption, although we know that they are. Logan just covered that. They're also about public safety, which I know is a topic that is top of mind for a lot of voters. It definitely proved itself so in the 2024 November elections. So my question for you is, how does automated record sealing reduce the level of low-level encounters that police face? And what does that mean for officer workload and morale on the ground?
Well, I'm glad I get to go after Logan because he kind of set me up for this question. He mentioned how so many individuals face challenges with getting suitable housing and getting just regular jobs due to the people doing background checks, which would exclude them in a lot of situations. And when that happens, people feel like they are almost forced into crime. They are committing low-level acts of survival crime just to make ends meet, or to find a place to stay, or to find something to take to sell, to have a little bit of money to buy food, or provide their children with something. And those are the low-level offenses that, we're really prioritizing for the clean slate work that we do here at Archery. We're really working with law enforcement across the country and talking to them. We recognize, as a former law enforcement officer myself, that there are individuals who unfortunately cycle through the system because they have no other available options. And it's these barriers that are placed before them that are putting them in situations where they otherwise would most likely not commit crime. So what happens with that is we're seeing, a national recruitment and retention crisis of law enforcement. So we have less law enforcement officers expected to do more work, expected to solve crime, expected to answer 911 calls for service. And at the same time, you have individuals who are cycling through for these low-level offenses, like I said, that officers, yes, have to do their job and hold people accountable, but under other circumstances, those crimes might not have taken place if they were afforded better opportunities. So when you have less officers trying to do more things and then being bombarded with people who, with clean slate policy implementation, could otherwise get jobs, get suitable housing, make a life for themselves, officers are now forced to also engage in that. And that causes officers to have to work more than their standard 8, 10, or 12-hour shift, additional overtime that makes them exhausted. They're not seeing their families. They're not taking care of their own mental health and well-being. And something else that I think often goes undiscussed. Police officers care about the communities they serve, and they often do talk to the individuals that they have unfortunate, interactions with, because we want to know how we can help. And I know over the course of my career, a lot of the individuals that I had to unfortunately arrest, they would tell me simply, I didn't have enough money, so I had to steal this so that I could find a place to stay for me and my kid tonight. And it goes to show you that something as simple as clean slate policy could basically eradicate a lot of those low level crimes that officers have to spend a lot of time on, that take away their attention from more pressing and concerning crime.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and it reminds me of something that Logan mentioned in terms of the onerousness of the current petition-based system. If you are a law enforcement officer and you're interacting with somebody who's letting you know that the reason they had to commit the crime is because they don't have a place to stay tonight, obviously that's not somebody who's going to be able to then reasonably navigate the petition-based system to seal criminal records. So I think that perfectly makes sense to me. You also, as a law enforcement officer, do a lot of traffic stops, various other interactions with the community. So to follow up on your previous answer, a lot of critics of Clean Slate worry that sealing records hides information from law enforcement that they might reasonably need to access during these stops or during other investigations or things like that. Can you clarify what access officers retain under most current Clean Slate laws and why this still aligns with maintaining community safety?
Yes, I did an interview soon after New York Clean Slate had passed, because that was one of the biggest criticisms. The fear was now no one's going to be able to access records that people should be able to access. And that's completely untrue, unfounded, unsupported in every way. Although Clean Slate laws do vary from state to state, something that is consistent is that law enforcement agencies will still remain able to access records. Individuals that are working with special populations, in most cases, if you're working in a nursing home, or if you're trying to become a teacher, or if you are trying to apply for a concealed carry permit, all of those individuals would still be subjected to having their records seen. So law enforcement would not be unable to do background checks when necessary. What Clean Slate policy does is it does not allow general public access. So it would not allow someone who is trying to rent out an apartment to see it. It wouldn't let someone who's working in a regular job that doesn't require security clearance or any type of, super high level security, wouldn't allow them to see that criminal record. So I think that is one of the things we focused on here, is just educating people, educating officers, and educating skeptics, because the people who need to see the records will be able to see the records.
Sorry, on mute. You would think after a couple of years of this, I would have learned that, but alas. Speaking of that, educating law enforcement, educating folks who are affected by access to criminal record databases, I dropped in the chat a recent piece that Jillian and I co-authored ahead of the National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives Conference that we both presented at, as well as hosted an event to network and talk with female law enforcement officers about what criminal record sealing means in their communities and how to help them navigate this new normal of, yes, there are criminal records that are sealed, but no, it does not mean that you cannot access them when you need to carry out justice. So would definitely check that out if you have time as well. Liesl, obviously frequent flyers that Jill talked about. Once they interact with the policing system as part of the criminal justice system, then they move over into the court system. unless they're deflected or diverted or something else. But that, of course, is a conversation for another day or maybe for later today. So these frequent flyers in the justice system come back in front of a court from time to time and time again, which obviously is not ideal, going back to government efficiency and effectiveness. In your experience as a prosecutor, how does record sealing impact prosecutorial decision-making and courtroom efficiency? And can automation reduce some of the strain on limited prosecutorial resources? And if so, how?
So I'll start with the decision-making kind of idea when we talk about frequent flyers and repeat offenders. The issue really out there with frequent flyers and repeat offenders is somebody who's committing crimes over and over again, often the same type of crime, but generally they're still under supervision when it's happening. It's not like they've been convicted, they've finished their sentence successfully, and then have this period of time where they've done nothing and then commit it again and then do the same thing. It really is generally short in time. It's individuals that are struggling, and so that they aren't having those long periods of no criminal activity. So when I look at clean slate and I think about how it actually affected my decision-making as a prosecutor, and I should say I was a prosecutor in Colorado before clean slate was implemented. However, there was still petition expungement. So certainly saw those sealed records at times, and it was quite infrequent that you would even see them. But the crimes that are being sealed are low-level nonviolent. They are years in the past. So even if they were a full conviction on that person's record that I could still see, it probably would not affect much of my decision-making for a bail amount. It would not affect much of my decision-making for a plea agreement, because they're not weighted the same. They're low level and they're years in the past. So decision-making wise, I would say clean slate just doesn't really affect that. I mean, it's going to be the same decision whether that was sealed, which again, you can generally see it in the records. Some states allow you to use it, others don't. In Colorado, you could not use a sealed record when arguing bail. But you could see it. But again, I'm just not sure it would change any decision at all versus if it was unsealed in those cases. So decision-making, I'm not sure it just does anything. As far as efficiencies though, one of the very interesting things about like the petition-based system is you get a petition in and you have to find this case file. Again, often years in the past, generally one you did not work on. You have to go figure out what the case was, what's going on with it. Is it an appropriate petition? Is it the right type of offense that can be petitioned? A lot of times you have to look up the law because you can't remember which ones are or not. And I mean, it just takes time and consideration. Where if there's something automated where, the statute knows which offenses can be expunged, it can be done without the review in that way. I can see how it definitely saves time and resources just to make it quick and seamless. And like I said, these are so far in the past, a lot of times it just becomes a hassle and not a real consideration.
Yeah, well, I think those are two of the best answers you could hope for, and that it can help save time and resources and not have any type of impact on prosecutorial decision-making, I think would be the ideal here. Something I mentioned earlier, which is deflection and diversion. A lot of programs for deflection or diversion are run through prosecutors' offices. Can you speak to how clean slate policies might intersect with these diversion programs? And is there any synergy between those two?
I think clean slate is actually perfect for those cases. I mean, I think it can be useful even when there are those low-level convictions. But arrests do show up on records, and especially when we're talking about non-law enforcement, people who are employers or landlords, they don't always know how to read the records. So they may see something on that criminal record, and it may have only been an arrest. It may have been an acquittal, meaning the person was actually found not guilty. It could have been dismissed because there was insufficient evidence or somebody else was found to have done the crime. But in the public eye, you may not know how to read that record and may not know what has happened. Same kind of goes with diversion and deflection. If somebody's being diverted or deflected, that means that there will not be a conviction on that person's record. And that means that there had been time and attention from either law enforcement or prosecutors to determine this person is not a public safety risk. They may just need a little support and services. We may want to monitor them for a small amount of time to make sure they stay out of trouble. And then we have agreed that this should be dismissed on their records, so that there are not collateral consequences that follow them. So does saying that, like, that's the kind of purpose of clean slate, right? Is to make sure that some of these offenses for individuals that we know have been law abiding for quite some time will not continue to follow them and create hurdles for them in life. And so the two really, to me, work perfectly together because they're really trying to address the same issue and have the same outcome. And without clean slate, the purpose and the motivation behind diversion and deflection may actually be missed without some sort of sealing of that record.
Thank you. So expanding on the topic of frequent flyers, Logan, from a systems level view, how does clean slate reduce recidivism or recontact with the justice system? Can you share any data or trends that show the post-conviction benefits of sealing records once individuals remain crime-free for a number of years?
Sure. Yeah, we actually have years of research proving that one of the best ways to reduce recidivism is to help former offenders secure meaningful employment. So Pennsylvania has arguably the most mature clean slate framework of pretty much any state out there. And there's been quite a bit of work done in Pennsylvania showing that the clean slate efforts there have improved employment and housing outcomes for folks with whose records get sealed, reducing recidivism rates, among participants. There's been work in Michigan. A study in Michigan found that individuals with expunged records had 5-year recidivism rates of just 4%, which is much lower than the control group in that case. And then there's economic benefits as well. JP Morgan, Verizon, there's many companies that also support clean slate because of the many economic benefits that it has. One of the issues in the United States is, up until recently, is we've had an extremely strong labor market. And it's been hard for companies to hire good people. And actually, people who get employment after a conviction through a clean slate are no less likely to quit early. In fact, their turnover rates are actually lower than many folks in the general population. So you have all these data points coming together to show that clean slate is one of the best methods we have for helping people basically obtain the basic building blocks of life and put their life back together.
Yeah, I think the incentive piece of clean slate is important because not only does it allow someone to move on once their record is sealed, but I would believe that also prior to the record being sealed, the possibility of knowing that your record will be sealed if you remain crime-free and focus on getting your life back together could be a pretty powerful rehabilitative incentive as well. A follow-up question for you, Logan, when we're looking at generally just communities and how they're responding to people re-entering society. You talked a little bit about some of the employers that are employing second chance hiring and initiatives to try to bring people back into the workforce. Can you expand a bit on how this plays into, obviously, R Street is a group that promotes free markets and real solutions. I think the labor market is certainly a good example of that. Can you just expand a little bit on how you feel that clean slate plays into a free market response that allows people to live a free and prosperous life without government intervention?
Sure. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that the unemployment rate for people with a record is over 30%, or it hovers around 30%. That's actually higher than the national rate was during the Great Depression. And that is devastating. It basically doesn't allow people an opportunity to ever get back on their feet. And another reason for this is the expanding use of background checks. I looked into this company, Certified Background, recently. They went from about a dozen college and university customers 15 years ago to over 500 today, doing background checks on folks just applying for school, trying to better their lives, right? I just think most people could agree that denying education to people who want to get an education is just counterproductive. So the economic benefits of allowing people to to put their lives back together if they want to are so numerous. It's almost it would take much longer than we have time for today to list them all. I mean, I could go over some of the benefits to government, for probation officers, who often are dealing with clients with many past convictions. When records are sealed automatically, those officers don't have to spend time, helping their clients navigate the petition system, navigate all these artificial barriers to housing and employment. It just reduces paperwork and time spent on all this stuff. And it gives criminal justice professionals a clearer picture of the folks who are truly high risk. By keeping those folks, by getting the nonviolent drug offenses, getting the criminal mischiefs off the record system, it cleans them up and gives us a clear picture of the folks we really should be working on. Yeah, so it's one of the, I think, most promising bipartisan criminal justice reform efforts out there, and it's I'm really excited that we've made so much progress in the past few years.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair to say, thinking about the probation and parole system. Obviously, there are a ton of people in our country on community supervision at the federal and overwhelmingly at the state level that we don't necessarily think of when we think of people who are currently under government purview for having committed a crime. A lot of them are out in the community, so allowing them to kind of move forward and helping the probation and parole officers who, like Jill mentioned, with law enforcement are facing a recruitment and retention challenges these days, as are probation and parole officers. So that's not certainly lost on the system at all. And the additional point that you brought up, of course, is with jobs and employment. We know that even the presence of a background check reduces the presence of a criminal record that pops up during a background check reduces the chance of somebody getting a callback by 50%, which kind of flipped the other way means somebody who doesn't have a record and has had their record expunged will be 2 times as likely as they would have if they still had the record to get that call back. And so, of course, how are we expecting people to be productive members of society if they're not able to earn a gainful income of their own accord? So much appreciated on that. So now that we've covered all of the bases with regards to the practical implementations of clean slate policy as it pertains to the roles that these system actors play, I want to ask the full panel to kind of have a conversation together and give us some key takeaways. So the first question I have for all three of you is, what is one clean slate myth that you hear most often, and what is the reality? Lisa, I'll start with you.
I'm going to take the easy one because I just feel like we hear it so often, which is that clean slate's going to, get rid of everybody's criminal record, and so nobody's going to know what they've done, and law enforcement's not going to be able to consider that, or prosecutors aren't. And as everybody I think's mentioned multiple times, generally, pretty much across the board, it's low-level offenses, non-violent offenses for sure, and we're talking about people who have been crime-free for a period of time, and that still can be seen by prosecutors and police. So I'm sorry I took the easy one, guys, but that one just seems to come up all the time.
Thanks for that. Jill, I'll get your myth here in a second, but I'd love for you to expand on something Liesl said, which is that, yes, overwhelmingly, clean slate laws only apply to low-level nonviolent offenses. You mentioned the New York law, which is one of the more all-encompassing clean slate laws that goes beyond maybe just this sort of lowest level population. And you brought up a good point. I think you did a media interview or some conversations back when that law passed about, the eligibility of folks for record sealing and expungement. Of course, it's following the completion, a number of years following the completion of their sentence, but their sentence is not just their time behind bars. Their sentence is also the remainder period of community supervision following incarceration, whereby some people just will never become eligible. Can you kind of draw out on that and help us understand, even in the cases where clean slate laws go beyond low-level nonviolent, how that actually would interplay in reality with whether these people would or would not ever have their records sealed to begin with?
So first of all, Lisa, you stole my answer, but I think you stole all of our answers. I'll do the myth first, if that's okay with you, Sarah. To expand a bit on what Lisa had said, you know, I've done a lot of engagement with, you know, advocates, lawmakers, policymakers, and law enforcement, particularly to ask them their concerns if they have any about clean slate. And as Liesl noted, um, some of them think it erases every single record and it erases serious criminal records. And, you know, law enforcement's biggest pushback is, oh, it's going to make our job harder, as I'm sure prosecutors, parole officers that don't understand the nuances of the policy would believe as well. I want to say, and I'm sure all my fellow panelists will agree, that it's not true. And frankly, it's quite dangerous to misunderstand those laws so badly. So because, as Liesl noted, in most states, it does apply to specific nonviolent offenses, and it does apply to someone who has remained crime-free for an extended amount of time. There's a strict criteria, no sexual offenses in most states, no violent offenses in most states. But as Sarah was saying, certain states, such as New York, they decided to expand it well beyond what the traditional scope of crimes included was. And something most people didn't even take into consideration was if you are convicted of a serious violent crime, like a manslaughter, you are going to get 10 to 15 years in prison in the state of New York, typically. You are then going to be on parole for many, 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 many years. And that was the concern because New York's clean slate law did expand to include some violent crimes such as manslaughter, first degree assault, etc., those of which carry very high prison sentences. And then following that incarceration, you would then be on parole for most of your life. One of the conversations I think Sarah is talking to is we were speaking to one of our colleagues over at the Brennan Center maybe a year or two ago, and we were talking about murderers. And, you know, obviously New York's law, again, went farther beyond than most of the other states did. But people who are convicted of murder are going to be on parole for most of their life until they're way too old to engage in any type of crime. So I think that is something that most people don't understand. The community supervision portion can be for parole or probation for those that have committed serious violent crimes. It's going to be decades that they're on parole, and then their clean slate wouldn't start until successful completion of their parole time, plus whatever that state has dictated post community supervision. So like I said, in certain cases, some individuals would never be eligible just because their community supervision time is so long.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. I think it's really important because it does come up time and time again, the question between violent offenses versus nonviolent offenses. And I think very understandably, people are far more comfortable with nonviolent offenses being expunged, or sealed, but I think it's important to also recognize the reality that some states will be pursuing this for other offenses, and what does that mean in the practical kind of side of the equation. So thanks for that. Final myth, I'll go over to you, Logan.
Yeah, well, at least we'll take the big myth, right? So I'll take another angle on it here. Clean slate is usually referred to as automatic record sealing, right? Automated record sealing. There's usually an automated component to how people talk about it. I know some folks in the field who say, wait. This is not an automatic process. This requires technical investment. This requires legal investment. This requires states actually put up some upfront money, you know, to implement a clean slate program properly before they can actually get any of the benefits from it. You know, so even in places with automatic sealing laws, the rollout of clean slate has been slow, uneven, and like I say, it comes with a price tag. So in Michigan, for example, you know, clean slate is ongoing, implementation is ongoing, but they have faced technical delays, they have faced legal delays, and so there's still people waiting, right, who are eligible to get their records cleared that might continue waiting for a while. So while the goal of clean slate is automation, the reality is often something short of true automation. Often there's still too many people in the loop, too many antiquated type of forms to fill out. What we really want, right, is a 21st century digital automated record sealing system, and that takes resources. So the takeaway here, I guess, is, you know, if you're going to set up a clean slate program, you know, invest in it and provide your court system with the resources to make it a reality and to make it beneficial for people.
Thanks, Logan. For those watching who engage in advocacy, this is, I think, the $1,000,000 question that we're going to hopefully get some answers to from these three. What is your elevator pitch for Clean Slate, or how would you explain it to a skeptical lawmaker in under a minute? Logan, kick it back to you.
Wasn't ready for that one, I guess. Yeah, elevator pitch on Clean Slate. Yeah, I mean, I would just have to go back to kind of the beginning. You know, everybody makes mistakes, Mr. Senator. I'm sure you've made a few, right? So I think when you frame it like that, when you frame it in a way that people kind of can apply think about it in terms of their own lives, right? I think you can help bring people along. The other thing I'll say on that is if you know a legislator or a policymaker comes from a religious background, I found that folks from the church community, from the faith community, even if they're so-called, tough on crime types, generally speaking, they can be a little more receptive to Clean Slate because there's this redemptive message kind of embedded in there, right? And that's kind of, it's the message of Christianity, it's the message of Islam, it's the message of many world religions. So that, I think, is something you can do to kind of, if you're going to do an elevator pitch, an appeal to faith can sometimes work.
Thanks, Logan. Jill?
Okay, so I'd say as a retired cop, I do understand some people's concerns, but the bottom line is that Clean Slate does not help career criminals. It helps the people who are not the problem anymore. Looking at decades of both policing and criminological research, we know that roughly like 3%, and I've seen studies as low as 1 and studies as high as 6, but a very, very small percentage of the population commit about 60% of the violent crime that actually scares people in the community. And Clean Slate policies would filter out those who've moved on and stayed out of trouble for years so that law enforcement can focus their resources where they're needed most. And where they're needed most are the people that are out there committing that 60% of violent crimes that makes people feel unsafe, unwilling to want to engage with their neighbors. So Clean Slate doesn't wipe serious records. Law enforcement still has access for in certain situations for investigations, for stops, and importantly for hiring decisions into the law enforcement community. It does stop punishing people for decade-old, low-level, for the most part, mistakes, so that they can get work, they can get housing, and most importantly, they can stay stable in their own lives. So ultimately, and I think all of us alluded to this in one regard, that will reduce recidivism. It will clear out backlogs, and it will help all criminal justice stakeholders spend less time chasing ghosts and more time solving real crime and solving real cases.
Thanks, Jill. I'll piggyback off of that real quick and plug something else you just wrote recently. It is May 14th, which is smack in the middle of National Police Week, which is the week during which communities come together to honor the daily sacrifices that law enforcement makes to protect the peace. And Jill wrote this piece highlighting ways that Clean Slate can do just that and help make police jobs easier. So definitely check that out as well if you get a minute. Lisa, I'll turn to you for your elevator pitch.
Yeah, I think for my elevator pitch, I usually focus on that this isn't trying to erase accountability. The individuals we're talking about have either, pled guilty, been found guilty, and have kind of served their time and gone through the process. And so it's not to remove that accountability. They've already taken accountability. This is to remove the unnecessary barriers for jobs and housing and education. And it's funny because I always hear people kind of say, I just don't understand why, these criminals won't become productive members of society. And it's like, well, we don't allow them to. If we're going to say, yes, you've done your time and that, come back to be in society, but we're going to hold this thing over your head over everything you try to do to be a productive member of society, it's really counterintuitive. And as Jill pointed out, it unfortunately sometimes leads people to go back into crime rather than to be productive because they don't see a lot of options otherwise. So really just leaning into that idea of they haven't held accountable, and now it's time for us to help them be productive in society.
Great. And Lisa,
I'll just actually jump in there real quick, Sarah. There's a quote and from an old R Street piece on Clean Slate that I like. Unfortunately, I didn't write this. I wish I had, but I'll just read it. This is talking about some of the occupational barriers that we put up for folks with a record. And here's the quote. Now, in some states, virtually the only profession open to a once convicted felon is that of a burglar. He is barred from other activities because he's presumed to be of a person of bad moral character, regardless of the nature of the felony or its relevance to his intended occupation. And I just thought that was so clever. It's like, it's true. It's to Liesel's point. We ask, it's like, why are these habitual criminals, why can't they get their lives back on track? And it's right. We've only allowed them to be burglars in some sense because we've restricted them from becoming hairstylists, nail technicians, nurses, all these various occupations. And Clean Slate just, it allows people to change their lives, right? It allows people to go on a track other than becoming a burglar. And that is the goal, I think, of any good criminal justice policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And Logan, it just reminds me when you think about the barriers, not only that society places on people with records to get their lives together, as we say, but also governmental barriers that are imposed. It just reminds me of how many exclusions and prohibitions there are on people with criminal records from accessing various social safety net programs or housing programs or educational opportunities and things like that. So it goes even deeper than just the kind of the market side of it. It also goes into how we treat people with criminal records in relation to government assistance programs and things like that as well.
You're right. It goes beyond Clean Slate. It goes to another one of our street specialties, actually, which is occupational licensing reform. And we have a massive catalog of work on that question. And these two subjects really go hand in hand.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Logan and Liesel. I think that's a perfect transition into the questions from the audience, because we actually had one exactly about how does getting rid of people's records hold them accountable for their crimes then? And I think you answered that perfectly in your previous answer. So we'll kick to the next question, which is, what do you see as the biggest obstacle to passing clean slate laws nationwide? And how can organizations or advocates help work to overcome it? This is open to anyone.
I'll answer just because I just had this conversation like 10 times in the last 2 weeks. I think misinformation is fueling fear. And I think it all starts with education. So trying to make sure that decision makers, or who we hope are decision makers, and we hope are in there giving their input and their feedback on, why these laws are important and why these laws need to move forward. I think that having individuals understand what Clean Slate does, what its goals are. And again, understanding the distinction between clean slate law or clean slate bills that have been introduced at the federal level versus clean slate laws that are being introduced all over the country, because they vary. Most of them are pretty consistent, but there are outliers, of course. But the most important thing is getting the proper stakeholders in the room, like who will be impacted by this, besides the individuals who will hopefully one day be eligible for a clean slate. You need to get the system actors in there as well, so they can express their concerns, express their hesitancy or reluctance, but most importantly, understanding what it is this is going to do and how it will benefit them and not hinder their ability to do their job.
And I'll just add quickly, I completely agree it's an education thing, because from what I've seen, and I will admit that we have other leads on our team that do a lot more of this work, but across the aisle, when you actually sit down and explain to somebody what Clean Slate is, almost everybody seems to understand it and understand the value in it. So it's not really a difference of political opinions or beliefs around it. It's more just not understanding even what it does and how it's affecting people. And so I completely agree with what Jillian said, which is it's an education thing and making sure people actually understand what it does without misinformation of what it does and how it can actually help.
Yeah, I echo all that. I think the biggest obstacle to passing clean slate laws nationwide is basically like fear-driven opposition from folks who don't really understand it. And it's also often fueled by misinformation. I sometimes I hear we've heard that law enforcement won't be able to access the stuff, but in most places, sealed records are still accessible to law enforcement and courts. But that nuance is lost often. One of the kind of a more serious, more I don't know, kind of evidence-based, I would say, piece of opposition is ban the box. The results of the efforts from ban the box a few years ago. I don't know if listeners are familiar with ban the box, but this was a series of reforms that a bunch of states implemented. It was basically to take away the box on employment forms saying, I have been convicted of a felony. No longer allow that box to occur, and have employers wait until the end of the hiring process to do the background check. After these reforms were implemented, they didn't really have some of the results that advocates had hoped for. And I see opponents to Clean Slate often citing ban the box work. Some of ban the box program evaluations as a reason. It's like, oh, it didn't work with ban the box. Here's why it won't work with Clean Slate. In my opinion, I think this is kind of comparing apples to oranges. I think ban the box and Clean Slate are really different policies. In my opinion, ban the box didn't work because employers would just basically wait until the end of the hiring process and run the check anyway. Clean Slate is fundamentally different, in my opinion, because now when that employer goes to run the check, they won't find anything. There won't be anything there to find. So if you hear opposition surrounding the results from ban the box, I would just say Clean Slate has some important distinctions that make it, I would say, a much better policy overall.
Thanks, Logan. I will add one additional challenge to passing Clean Slate, and I guess the second part of this question was the action item of how can we overcome it. I don't know that I have the answer to that. I wish I did. I think I would be doing a lot of other things right now if I did have the answer to this question for all of the states. But it is the budgetary and resource concern that states are facing. It's 2025. There was a lot of federal funding that came down to states throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and afterwards. A lot of it is set to expire this fiscal year. And then obviously we have a federal government that is working on paring back federal spending, not increasing it. So there's a challenge, like Logan mentioned earlier, the resourcing challenge of Clean Slate is taking whatever current system that states have for criminal record sealing and expungement and basically putting it fully in a digital form by which a system can sort through it and automatically flag various records for automated sealing or expungement. Obviously, that does, as Logan mentioned, come with a upfront fiscal cost. But I think the overcoming it results in, I guess the way that we have to overcome it is look farther down the line, right? Yes, this is an investment right now, and it's going to cost a good amount of money right now, make no mistake about that. But what it does allow you to do in the future is, all of the people Liesl was talking about, the courts that have to go through these records and understand what's there and what's not and what's eligible and what's not. And then there, the prosecutors have a role in that, the court employees have a role in that, and all of that, once you automate the system, your cost can move from whatever it currently is to virtually just the cost of running the software that you have doing the automation. So I think it's about looking further in the future, which of course, this fiscal year is difficult for a lot of states because states, unlike the federal government, don't have the ability to borrow. So they do year over year have to balance their budgets. So that is a big obstacle, I think, to passing Clean Slate laws nationwide. But I would encourage advocates to talk about, to not shy away from the fiscal discussion because it is real, but still make the point that down the line, the fiscal benefits are going to be far greater, not only because your system is going to cost less, but also because you're going to have, as we've talked about throughout this conversation, fewer people recycling into the system and becoming these frequent flyers that then drain more and more and more taxpayer resources as they have 1, 2, 3 criminal offenses versus being able to truly move on after their first one. So that would be what I would say.
So I'll just jump in there for 1 second. I'm just really glad you brought up the cost question, because that is something I do hear out there among opponents to Clean Slate. And you're so right. In so many things, not just in criminal justice policy, but in public policy in general, if you take a bit of a long-term horizon rather than a short-term view, the cost saving question becomes well, it becomes moot. It becomes more than moot. It becomes basically what you're doing is you're laying down an investment to save more money in the future. And this can be difficult for some I think people in courts and policymakers to understand. I used to work in a court system, right? And the computers that we used had that kind of green DOS command prompt style, kind of from war games, from the 80s. Like, this was not a graphical user interface even. There was no mouse. It was all command line. And to update these systems to actually implement an automated record expungement system takes a lot of investment. I mean, updating these systems are extremely old in a lot of court systems. So updating this does require a bit of an initial investment, but you get the 1-2 punch of having an updated court record system as well as a automated record sealing system if you do this right. So I think, yeah, the cost question is something I think we kind of don't address enough. But it is something to really think about in a long-term type of way rather than short-term.
Yeah, thanks, Logan. We have one more question from the chat, which asks, can you talk about the state of clean slate laws in Kentucky and/or West Virginia? I will start by saying R Street does not work on criminal justice policies in Kentucky or West Virginia, at least not in my experience here. I don't know if anybody else on the panel has had experience working in those states. But what I will say in response to this is West Virginia is one of those states, and Logan, it's a great segue from your last answer, that from my understanding does have a quite antiquated record keeping system that would pose a challenge in terms of modernizing it in the ways that Logan is talking about. That's all I can really speak to about West Virginia. But with regards to Kentucky, I do know that there is a initiative for clean slate going on in the state that has a number of different partners involved. I just put the link to the Clean Slate Kentucky website in the chat. I think it's got folks and anybody on this call who's from these works can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that dream.org works there, Right on Crime works there. I would imagine the ACLU of that state is involved and some others, but that's what I
can chime in because of all the clean slate stuff I've been writing lately.
Awesome.
So Kentucky does have a very big and active coalition, and although this session they were not able to secure a sponsor, they did generate a lot of conversations and a lot of discussions, and they also are working on the ACLU specifically is working to establish like a task force to try and during the interim session to try and figure out. It's a bipartisan task force to look at some important data because like we're always saying, at least in our field, data is something that helps drive smart policy. We need to know what's going on based on data that's collected. So in Kentucky is still very active in that we do have high hopes that next year will bring a better year. But in the interim there, they are working. West Virginia, as we've all said, we don't do work at R Street in West Virginia, but they themselves have been doing very incremental steps as it pertains to expungement. They haven't yet had any bill introduced as it pertains to automated record sealing, but they did introduce this session. It didn't pass, but they were looking to expand eligibility for expungement to individuals who did complete successful rehabilitation programs or individuals that were enrolled in some type of diversionary program. It would have granted expungement. Unfortunately, that bill was passed. That bill was introduced but did not pass before the session concluded. But they don't have as big of a coalition currently in the state of West Virginia.
Great, thanks, Jill. Anybody else with thoughts or comments on Kentucky or West Virginia? Great. I think we can call that a wrap then. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning into this conversation. And a huge thank you to my esteemed colleagues, Liesl, Logan, and Jillian for joining us today. And we'll see you next time.